record. Jason is arriving as well. So again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the, if I'm counting right, then it's the 7th salon of the series, maybe the 6th. And today our topic will be counterculture and similarities between the 60s and nowadays. And we have two special guests today. And thank you so much for joining us, Mark and Alethea. Mark Taylor is a postmodern religious and cultural critic, and he has published more than 20 books on theology, metaphysics, art and architecture, media, technology, economics, and postmodernity. He received his doctorate in the study of religion from Harvard University, taught at Williams College until he moved to Columbia University, where he chaired the Department of Religion. Alethea Harnish is his student at Columbia University, and she's pursuing a double major in theater arts and philosophy. And she spent the entirety of her high school career acting in and developing programming within a nonprofit youth theater company in her hometown. Because of this experience, she hopes to create her own nonprofit theater company that brings awareness to controversial topics. And at Columbia, they co-teach a course on the relation between the counterculture in the 60s and countercultural currents today, which exactly is our topic today. The course is entitled Hippie Physics, Counterculture and Cyberculture. And I very much would like to ask what hippie physics is, but I have another first question to you. Let's start with the basics, maybe. So can we or should we define what counterculture is, if this is today's topic?
Sure. I'll start, then Alethea can join in. I mean, we were thinking of the counterculture primarily in the United States, although it was a global phenomenon. As you suggest, during the 60s. I mean, there's always going to be a counterculture. Right? Culture and countercultures go together in certain ways. But in the 60s, especially in the States, it was particularly poignant and disruptive, partly because of all the developments in the immediate in the years after the Second World War. The 60s really began with sort of a reaction against the normalization that had come after the Second World War. You had sort of the baby boomers who were just being born, reacting strongly against their parents' world and culture, but it was also tied up with social, economic, and political developments at that time. Developments in racial problems, the sexual revolution. The 60s really began with the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960. Economic problems, and of course the war in Vietnam. And part of what emerged, and we'll talk more about the particular contours, but part of also what emerged by the end of the 60s was a counterculture. That is to say, a certain reaction to the counterculture. Right? There were ways in which, in ways that are not immediately evident to many people, developments in the 60s led to the whole computer revolution, PC revolution that we see going on today. But it was also the time when there was enormous religious unrest, and the birth of sort of conservative and fundamentalist religion took place also in the late 60s. So Alethea and I, in doing this course, she was interested in looking at the 60s, as she once said to me, through the eyes of somebody who lived through it. And I was interested in looking at the 60s through the eyes of her generation. So Alethea, why don't you speak about it a little bit?
Yeah, I think when I try to define counterculture, I get stuck because it's so broad. But I think it's like the most like core aspect of it is that it's generally associated with the youth, and it's like a a reaction to the culture or the political and social circumstances that we were given from our parents' generations. And generally, like, it's a question of whether it's accepted or it's pushed back against. And the counterculture, I mean, especially in this one that we're looking at in the 60s in America, like, it's very much this religious and social, like, recreation of how the youth choose to live their lives, and it's pushing back against what they've inherited. And like Mark was saying, like, I'm interested in this particularly because I think it maps very well onto like what my generation is dealing with today in terms of like how we've been dealing with particularly the development of technology and how it's been like, you know, significantly like shaking the structure of our social institutions and our political institutions in ways that we don't really know how to handle. And so there's just a huge rift between my generation and like the generation above us and then like the rest of the population. And there's, yeah, so it's like this two whole different frameworks of how to see the world that are like clashing with each other. Yeah, so that's kind of how I see it.
One of the in our course, one of my moments of recognition, which retrospectively is so obvious, was how much closer I was in the 60s to the Second World War than their generation is to the Vietnam War. Huge generation gaps that Alethea is talking about.
Right. Like my generation doesn't have the relationship to war in any way because America is so removed from violence in those ways as of the past 20 years. In terms of our personal experiences of it as civilians, and that's not necessarily like Mark's generation was dealing with the draft and those kinds of things, and so the militarization of the population is handled very differently now than it was then. So yeah, we see those things very differently.
And you know, as I teach it, you know, Alethea's generation, they were all born after 9/11, right? And you know what that means. You don't really become all that politically aware until you're what, 12, 13 or something like that, maybe. Which means that's, huh?
I said, yeah, maybe, if you're lucky.
Right. Yeah, if you're lucky. So, I mean, we're only talking about 7, 8, 9 years back. And so it's quite a trip for me to try to relive that through. But the fascinating thing is, you know, in this class that we're doing is, and we are genuinely co-teaching it. You know, so Alethea is an undergraduate. And Columbia, of course, has graduate students, so on and so forth. But I teach philosophy and science Mondays, and she teaches all the fun stuff on Wednesdays. But the course is probably the most, and this is my 50th and final year of teaching. And it's probably the most popular course I've taught. And the personal investment of the students is unlike anything I've ever seen. I mean, they, for reasons that maybe Alethea can help us understand, they are genuinely interested in what was going on. Right. First day of class, I asked them if they thought, or Alethea asked the class if they thought they missed the party, and most of them said yes.
Right. I mean, I think that this time in American history very much resonates with me and my peers because of all of the cultural similarities. I mean, like, of course, everyone's excited about the drug use and the art and the culture and that's being produced in that time and like trying to like recreate it now. But it's more so like the and I don't know if I fully agree with like some of the literature that talks, you know, specifically about like the youth being alienated from their society, but there is this feeling of like, this is what we're dealing with is so novel and we don't know what to do with it. And like, so the 60s, the youth culture of the 60s is like a predecessor or something to like help us understand how to deal with what we're dealing with now. And so it resonates in ways that like other historical time periods like don't necessarily. and there are remnants of the culture today, first in the people who, our grandparents and those kinds of things, but also like and we can talk about this more later too, like how directly the implications of the culture have created what we have today. So yeah.
Before we're starting to talk about these implications, I really would like to know what hippie physics is, what you have in your course title. So could you please elaborate this a little bit?
Okay, so let me take the first crack at that, and Alethea can fill in. Hippie physics, as we are understanding it, really has to do with the whole way in which quantum physics was appropriated by certain figures in the counterculture during the 60s. The course really originated when Alethea asked me what I was working on for my next book, and I told her I was working on a book on Hegel and quantum mechanics. And she said, well, that's weird because for you mentioned that Alethea was involved with theater. She's an actor as well as a playwright. And she said that for her thesis, she wanted to do a play about the 60s and the way in which certain kinds of spirituality drew on quantum mechanics. And that's sort of where this journey began. And if you look back to the whole story of the origin of quantum mechanics, it's really a really complicated and fascinating story. Because it was, of course, more or less invented by Bohr and Heisenberg in the 1920s. But then it got tied up, it got entangled with the whole politics of the Second World War and the creation of the atomic bomb, and this, that, and the other thing. And many of the pioneers in quantum mechanics were German and Jewish and were exiled from Germany. Heisenberg was not; he was a Lutheran, not a Jew. And so for many years, and the quantum revolution that took place in the 1920s completely called into question classical physics from Newton on, right? And it was resisted for many, many years. Einstein never accepted quantum mechanics, largely for two reasons. One, quantum mechanics is probabilistic and not deterministic. And Einstein believed till his dying day in his famous phrase that God does not play dice with the universe. The second reason was, in order for quantum mechanics to work, there has to be the possibility of something traveling faster than the speed of light. And Einstein never accepted that. So it was controversial for a long time, but it was also controversial because in Germany and much of Europe, and as well as much of the United States, it was identified as, and this is the word that was used, Jewish physics, right? And even in the United States, through the up through the 50s and 60s, it was not widely accepted. And what happened was that during the 70s, I think it was, right, Alethea, it was the 70s, right?
Late 60s, early 70s, yeah.
Late 60s and early 70s, there was a group of PhDs in physics and quantum mechanics gathered, of course, at Berkeley. They were unemployable because by this time job market had dried up. And they sort of revived and eventually legitimized quantum mechanics. And as it was growing up in Berkeley in California, where a lot of the countercultural stuff was going on, the vision of the world in quantum mechanics has certain resonances with the kind of holistic, organic vision of the world that was coming to expression in the counterculture. And you had popular texts, some by physicists like capper called the Tao of Physics, or the Dancing of the Wu Li Masters, where there was an effort to present sort of a synthesis between New Age spirituality and quantum mechanics. And that's the point that really that interested Alethea, because her mother was actually interested in that. Alethea, why don't you pick up on that?
Yeah, so I think important parts of what Mark was saying too is that like there weren't any jobs in physics departments in that country at the time, and if there were any jobs, it was all for making weapons for the Vietnam War, which was very like these are all students on the West Coast, like in Berkeley, which is one of the like epicenters of the counterculture and the youth movement at the time. So it's like this anti-war rhetoric and all of these like very it's all, you know, like peace, love, no war is happening there. So there's also the physicists who just like refuse to continue doing research for the military industrial complex. And then on top of that, all of this philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism, alongside you know, Hinduism that's more popular for like Ginsberg and the Beatles, those kinds of things, or those kinds of people, is coming over and like finding its way into the youth's like consciousness. And so they are experimenting with psychedelics, and they're like trying to like take these ideas that haven't really been proven scientifically yet and find ways to do so. And the ideas that they're dealing with are like non-locality and like entanglement, right? So it's like it's the ideas that they're working with are very religious in nature and very I mean, one of the biggest critiques Einstein had of quantum physics was that it was spooky action at a distance. So it was supposed to be like something that isn't founded in science itself. So like they're the first ones touching quantum after the World War II. And so like it immediately kind of gets assigned this like you're just a bunch of crazy hippies, or you're they were working with mediums and people who claim to be able to do telekinesis, as well as doing this like there are sound experiments that came out of that time alongside these like other experiments that ended poorly. And so there's the double movement there. But from there, even into like the raging new age movement that's happening now, like there's quantum is used in all of their rhetoric. It's adopted for the principles that the quantum seems to prove. And so it's like if you read through anything that's like being published in the past like 10 years, like they're almost everyone references quantum one way or another. But like, and I've had meetings with some of my mom's clients, and it's really interesting because they're dealing with the concepts, but it's not necessarily like the same thing. Like there's still that double movement of the sound scientific quantum, and then the like religious philosophy that's being built around it. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about hippie physics.
Thank you for clarifying it. As usual, whoever has a question or comment, just raise your hand and you will receive the floor as soon as possible. If no one at the moment, then let's go back maybe a little bit to the similarities between the countercultural movements in the 60s and today. Could you please talk a little bit about what kind of, if there was any direct impact did the counterculture in the 60s have on today's life?
Do you want to start, Alethea, or should I?
You go ahead
Okay.
and talk about kind of like the more political militaristic side, maybe, because I feel like that's
right.
Yeah.
So as we understand, as Alethea and I understand the counterculture in the United States in the 60s, there were two basic poles of that counterculture. One was a political pole, and the other was a more spiritual pole, if you will. The more political pole in this country, like Students for Democratic Society and so on and so forth, that were that used a lot of Marxist and Maoist rhetoric in calling for the dismantling of, as Alethea said, the military-industrial complex. Deep, deep criticisms of capitalism. Most of them had not read much Marx, but they spouted the rhetoric quite a bit. On the other side, you had partly as a result of the drug culture that Alethea was talking about, but the drug culture got tangled up with certain kinds of spirituality and so-called Eastern religions. Right? In this country, up until the 60s, in college and university departments of religion, they were mostly exclusively Western. And as a result of the 60s, there was an opening, and the war in Vietnam, so there was an opening up to non-Western religious traditions. And there was a particular interest in Hinduism and Buddhism in all of that. And these two poles really represented two ways of thinking about, I mean, in the 60s as now, it's hard to remember what 1968 was like in this country, right? In January of 1968, it was the Tet Offensive, massive military campaigns in Vietnam. In February, I was a senior in college in February, and President Johnson revoked all draft deferments. So that meant that unless you had a way out, and there were very few ways out, you were going to Vietnam. In March of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. I'm sorry, in March it was Prague Spring. You guys know that better than we do, right? In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated. In May, universities all over the world shut down, right? In the United States and in Europe. In June, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. In August, there was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which turned violent. In the midst of all of this, there had been in 67 racial riots all over the United States. I mean, the world is a mess, right? And young people and young people were being called upon to serve in the military, to defend a war they did not believe in, and a system that they felt was profoundly broken. And so the question for us at that time was, how do you resist the system, right? How do you change the system? Do you change the world to change consciousness? That's Marx, political. Or do you change consciousness to change the world? That's we call them mystics and militants, right? The mystics think if you can change consciousness and change the world. We'll come back to that in a minute, because it's out of the mystic pole that the computer revolution, the PC revolution emerges. That's where Silicon Valley comes from, right? It's kids doing dope in Haight-Ashbury during the 60s. And they were kids, right? 2 years before Steve Jobs founded Apple, he's roaming around India looking for his guru and liberation, right? But on the political side of all this, and now we're trying to get some of these similarities. The mystic and spiritual pole of the drug culture was basically libertarian. It was resistance to the system. Get the government off our backs, right? And if you listen to the language of the hippies in the 60s, it is very, very close to much of the language of the far right in politics in the United States today. They too are libertarian, right? In a strange sort of way. And there's much of the same rhetoric of non-government interference on the part of Silicon Valley, as well as the so-called neoliberal, the neoliberal economists and neoconservative political things. So you have, I mean, Hegel says if you push anything far enough, it turns into its own opposite. That's exactly what's happened. The left has become right in certain ways. And you have this strong kind of counterculture. So you have, again, we go back, you have a counterculture, right? The counterculture of the 60s bears an uncanny similarity to the counterculture of the far political right today. Alethea.
Yeah. Well, before we keep going, Mark, do you have an answer to this question in the group, in the chat, that says, where did they get their marks from if they didn't read it directly? Did someone popularize the marks?
I don't know where they go.
Yeah.
I mean, all I know is it's not hard to pick up, you know. I mean, they didn't have graphic novels at that time, so I assume it didn't come out of that. But you know, one of my vivid memories, I was at Harvard I started Harvard in the fall, studying for my PhD in religion in the fall of '68. In the spring of '69, there was and we talk about spring of '69 at Columbia and at Harvard and elsewhere too, but Alethea can talk about Columbia in a minute. But in the spring of '69 at Harvard, students took over University Hall. There was a police bust. I mean, it was a mess. But one of my vivid memories at Harvard, in the years that I was there, they had nobody in the Harvard philosophy department who taught Kant, Kierkegaard, Hegel, Nietzsche. The continental tradition was forbidden. Right? That spring, Hilary Putnam, who was a distinguished analytic philosopher, offered a course on Marx. Right? I went to try to get into that course, and there were over 400 students gathered outside trying to get into the course. Right? So it was, you know, it was a fashionable kind of thing that was sort of in the ether. But I had studied Marx. I had read Marx and Hegel as an undergraduate, and I knew from the conversations I had that this was all phony Marxism.
Yeah, I guess my only inclination is to say, like, it was being taught in the universities, but whether or not they truly like were dealing with the ideas in and of themselves, or if they were just spouting what they were reading, is what Mark is trying to make the distinction of. And like he referred to SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, a few minutes ago, and their like foundational text was written in Michigan in 1965 or 6, I believe. The Port Huron Statement, and it's like mostly rooted in Marxist texts, and Lenin and Mao like are other like figureheads for them, and so it's very much just like this idea of far left ideology that kind of carries them, and like Mark was referring to, on Columbia's campus in May of 1969, university students started to sit in 5 different buildings on campus. SDS had 4, and then SAS, students of the
African American studies.
Thank you. African American studies took the 5th building, and they were protesting against university expansion into Harlem. They were trying to build a big,
which is African American.
Right. It's the Black neighborhood, one of the biggest Black neighborhoods in Manhattan, even today. And we border right along. There's just one little park that separates us even now. And there's still a lot of controversy about how we are continuing to gentrify and move into Harlem. But there was a huge uproar against it, and they were planning to build this gym, and that it was going to be, they were going to have segregated entrances for Harlem residents and for university residents, and people were just not having it. And so the Black Student Society like came in and were protesting against it, and the students SDS kind of came in and overtook it and made it more about Colombia's involvement with Vietnam. And so there was like a kind of disagreements between the students themselves in terms of like what was more important to be protesting. But it was one of the first protests in the university sphere at that time that kind of like catapulted all these other university protests to happen.
Tell them about the bust.
The bus?
The bust.
Oh, sure. That was another big issue, is the police presence on campus. They had arrested hundreds of students after they held a dean hostage. They refused to leave the buildings, and they went in and arrested everybody, and students were beaten. Nobody died, but it was a big controversy of
violence. Or 700 students were arrested.
Right. And one of the bigger issues was academic, your standing within the university. And there's a lot of controversy around like the white, like, because these are all upper class white students who are protesting and from a place of privilege versus the Black students who are generally on scholarship and like have much more at stake. And then the add that on to the politics of the police coming in. And we read a really interesting book, Cornyn. What is his first name?
I forget. It's a collection of
but it's a collection of it's 1968, not 1969. It's called A Time to Stir. And it's just a collection of like all different reflections on the
firsthand.
On the protests. And it's really interesting read, but you can see all of the like tensions that still exist in people who were, 50 years later reflecting on what happened then.
And another part of the protest also was the university, and this was the same at Harvard and other schools too. The role of the university in promoting the war, the research being done, by different departments that are feeding into the Defense Department. The number of recruits from the Central Intelligence Agency that came from these elite Ivy League schools. So it was the involvement of the university with the corporatization and militarization of the university was also part of what was being processed. Now, and a significant difference, of course, between these protests in the United States and in Europe was that many of the leading schools in this country, of course, are private, not public. And so there are other, Berkeley and Wisconsin, Texas, they have big state systems, but a lot of these so-called elite institutions are private in this country.
Right. And that's something that's continued into today, connecting all of these protests to, of course, the politics are still there, but there are protests that still happen on campus today. The graduate students striking has been going on for a few years now. This past school year hasn't been nearly as prominent, but last school year people were storming into lectures given by President Bollinger, and there's still this ethos of like the protest, which is very much rooted in like starting in the 60s in America, like in terms of like this huge public support of a political opinion. And someone else asked in the group chat about how political ideas are spread most back then. And I think I use this to segue into like the protest song, which was a huge phenomenon that came about in this time period. Like Dylan's like one of the main figureheads of that, Bob Dylan. But there's countless.
But music was central. Each of our class sessions begins by considering a song from the period that Alethea has chosen, and it's really, really interesting to see how the music reflects this. And Alethea, you can say more.
Right, and it's of course complicated in terms of like at the same time, and like hip hop, and like particularly in the Bronx, is also starting to come out of this same like ethos. Of course, they're dealing with different things than the white population in America is at the time, but artists like Marvin Gaye, as well as like Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, they're all writing songs to communicate, or like and the youth are relating to these ideas, like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. It's a huge anti-Vietnam War song that became popular because of general anti-Vietnam sentiment among youth. And so like and whether it was popular before or it continued to, spread those ideas, it's doing both at the same time.
So you had rock and roll, you have folk, you have hip hop, and the artist also became involved in the social and political protests, actually. There's a question just flashed up that I didn't quite catch about today.
Yeah, it was actually the same question I wanted to ask you. So while in 68, popular music was really, really political. You mentioned a few examples, Alethea, but today it's maybe less so. And do you maybe have an explanation for that? And also we can think about whether this movement influenced popular music, or to what extent did these movements influence popular music back then and now, or the opposite way? So music influenced the movements.
I'll leave some of that. In the 60s, I've always thought that music was such a part of the political atmosphere of the times in the protests. Dylan, Joan Baez, some of the ones that Peter, Paul and Mary, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie,
Nina Simone,
and many of those were out, leading the marches. I mean, at Martin Luther King's March on Washington, Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary sang at that, in front of the Washington or Lincoln Memorial or whatever it was. It seemed to me less so, but that may be because I'm unplugged. Alethea is much better able to speak about the politics and music today.
Yeah, so it's a difficult question. Like I don't have like a straightforward answer, but I do think, if you look at the top charts now, it's almost always songs that are popular on TikTok at the time. And so it's which is not an apolitical space, but it is targeted to, the algorithm is created just to appeal to the largest audience possible, and to just to continue the cycle of use. And so if the users are not trying to talk about politics more, then of course the music that they're using is not going to be nearly as political. But I don't know necessarily to what extent, like why new political music isn't necessarily being made. I don't know if it's a reflection of the types of music, the genres that are coming out that are popular now, which are usually like EDM and rap are the two bigger, like movements today. And so I just
but you touched on this, and this is really, really a crucial link in all that, and that is social media. And the impact of social media, which, because television was only introduced in the 1950s, and so in the early 1960s, right, TV was relatively new. There were only 3 TV stations in this country. Even in the early 1970s, when we lived, my wife and I lived in Denmark, there were 2 national TV stations. That was all. And they weren't even on 24 hours, right? There were only 3 national newspapers in this country, right? So the media scene was very, very different. However, it was precisely at this period that you had the beginning of, as I indicated, we'll talk about that more, of what becomes the personal computer revolution, and that you have Marshall McLuhan. Right? And what year is Medium in the Message?
67.
67. He publishes Medium in the Messages in Medium. I mean, and he saw so much. He was thinking of electric culture, not digital culture. But when you look at, we just taught that book last week, and it is totally prescient.
Yeah. Before we go further, though, I think we had a hand.
Okay.
If you still wants to jump in.
Yeah. Charlie, you had a question or comment.
Oh, I was just going to ask, even before social media was popular, thinking about the George W. Bush administration, it's tough to think of, a big popular anti-war song, anti-Bush song that came out during that period. And so I was curious whether you had any thoughts about kind of in the pre-social media era, why music could have been less political as well.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think that there was it was almost a subversive kind of protest. Like punk rock is becoming popular like in the 90s. You think of Nirvana, and like it's very much just like a push against this kumbaya, like we're going to protest against the man, and it's very much it's a lot of like angst and like maybe just disillusionment with governmental systems in general. So like it is a protest in one sense, because it's pushing away from the true idea of a protest in terms of like raising your voice and pushing against the norms by subverting all of these normal
in the way Alethea puts that, I think is important, because again, here's an instance of where this the left in the 60s becomes the right of today. Certainly part of what was going on in the 60s was a deep suspicion of institutions, of government, of business, of the university, right? And a profound anti-authoritarianism in that. That goes with sort of the libertarianism in all that. And that distrust of institutions, and I'll come back to this in relationship to the young, that distrust of the institutions, that has become a political program of the right in this country. What Trump has done in this country, and my guess is that it's similar things in Hungary and other parts of Europe, is to instill a profound distrust of institutions. And a society cannot survive with that kind of distrust, it seems to me. And and part of and it's what makes the students' response to this course so interesting to me. I think, and I don't know if this counts, and I don't know when it started, whether this accounts for the lack of protest music. I think many of our bright, creative young people today are in despair and have very little hope. And part of that is the magnitude of the problems that we face, whether it's climate, which weighs heavily on young people, or whether it's economic disparities, or whether it's the racial problems. And when you add that kind of concern with a distrust of political institutions, right, there's hopelessness, right? And hopelessness is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you believe it can't be changed, it won't be changed. But again, we in the 60s, speaking as one who was there, we were deeply suspicious of these institutions, but we believed change could occur. Now, maybe that was naive. And in fact, many of the people who are arguing for change then are part of the problem now. I fully admit that. but it's an attitudinal difference. Alethea?
Yeah, and I think that it becomes like pretty obvious in the 90s if you're talking about like, you know, production of art in the United States in particular. Like trying to like, I'm racking my brain to think of like what are protest songs that I know of from that time period, and all I can really think of are like Rage Against the Machine, and like Lauryn Hill, Miss Lauryn Hill, I think is what she prefers now, had her MTV Unplugged in the early 2000s, and it's either like, you know, we're pushing against political issues surrounding like the war in the Middle East and like drug regulation and the prison system in America, or I'm pushing completely away from this into Christianity or like religious doctrine, and those are the ways of like out of this like hopelessness that's kind of been woven into the political consciousness of the youth at that time. And I don't know like how I see it, and I don't know, like, I mean, it's so new and nuanced, is that our like from the 90s, from like the real like integration of the internet with like popular, like just like the average Joe, the production of like new thought and art has significantly slowed, and we've just been recycling the same stuff from that time period, and so it looks new, but it's all kind of the same message, because we don't really know how to get out of this.
And that, I mean, that was actually the point of postmodernism: recycle, not originate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so now we're kind of stuck. So that's
well,
why
something you were
not happening anymore. But please.
Something you were saying a second ago, Mark, might be interesting. So you were talking about how the movement kind of shifted from being one on the left to being one on the right. And I think we generally don't think of the creative art creating types as being people on the right. We usually associate those with people on the left. And so could that be part of the explanation as well?
I think this is really complicated, because how to put this? I think your comment is exactly right. Those on the left think creativity and stuff comes from the left, not the right. But as I've explored some of this, and working with Alethea on this has been invaluable. I think many of us on the left, are not really open to understanding people that we regard on the right. That they're they are wrestling. Many of them are wrestling with the similar issues that others of us are wrestling with in their own way. And there's not a monopoly of creativity on this political axis, right? Part of our response, if we're going to get out of this mess, and I don't know if we can, we not only can ask them to understand them, I mean, listen to the way I'm talking, us, but we have to understand them in their work. You know, one of the, I mean, McLuhan, the two things you associate with McLuhan: the medium is the message, and global village. And he was a utopian who saw in this new electronic technology the possibility of connectivity, of bringing people together. I believe that 20, 30 years ago. And I started a company called Global Education Network to try to create a new kind of educational institution that would connect all people all over the world. We did it. We didn't succeed as a company, but there was this sense that connectivity was going to bring us together. But what I didn't foresee, and many didn't either, is that the very technology that connects us divides us. Right? And so this wonderful technology that was supposed to get us all together in this global village, we're now more divided and siloed than ever, right? And how you get out of those silos is very, very, very difficult. And of course, part of what has happened with the internet is that, once it was turned over to business, right? Sort of, it originated in universities to conduct research. Right? And, what the kids created, then government and business took over and completely transformed it. Right? And what drives the internet now, what drives all these algorithms we're talking about, is profit. Right? These algorithms are deliberately developed to addict users, and they're open about that. Watch the film The Social Dilemma. Right? They design these algorithms to addict people. So the kinds of addictions that we talk about, yes, there's all the drug stuff that comes out of the 60s, but guess what? Computers are doing something very, very similar to what the drugs are doing in the 60s, because the drugs came out of the 60s. I mean, the computers came out of the 60s, right? One of my close friends from college was a poet, songwriter. He became deeply involved in the computer revolution after writing all the lyrics for Bob Weir's Grateful Dead songs, right? And he said to me, Mark, we had the right vision, but the wrong stuff. It wasn't acid. He said, pointing to the computer, it was this, that PCs was going to be distributed systems, non-hierarchical, non-centralized, information in the hands of the people was going to be liberated, right? Until what happens? Business takes it all over and turns it into a profit machine fed by addiction.
Right. It's really interesting to look through the McLuhan now, because he's talking about technologies that seem like rudimentary to us because of our like relationship to smart technology and machine learning algorithms and those kinds of things. But you really, if you took out all of the like specific technological like references and put in everything that we're dealing with today, it reads the same. And like Mark was pointing out, the issue of surveillance, but I also think that like along these same lines, as we were talking about before, like the artists on the right are almost like, at least where I'm from like middle America, Indiana. And like when you look at like more rural populations and their relationship to art, it's usually less political because their lives are less political. In essence, away from like at least what I've experienced on the coasts, like politics are more relevant than religion, and that's not necessarily the same as it is in
Alethea says politics is my religion.
I do say that. But I think that technology has fed into and created a more political right in parts of the country that weren't necessarily very politically aware or like involved in like cared about politics, even if they were aware of what was happening. And so like the art itself can be seen as more apolitical because it's generally not like, that's not to the end of what they're writing about, thinking about, working towards. And that's an interesting like how can you have an argument between the right and the left? The right isn't fully the right. The right is something outside of that spectrum. But that's also only partially true. And that's just, I mean, we talk about that too. When you go back to the 60s, we haven't had this class yet this semester, but we're going to look at, the Christian right. And it's more obvious, just like, a little, not in the 60s as much, but more like late 70s, early 80s, when hip hop starts being really big, and the Christian right kind of starts to rally against hip hop music for political reasons, because of racism, because of all these cultural differences, and so like you see the push between the the religion and the political mind, and as well as like the various polarities within the politics itself.
But if you go back to the late 60s and early 70s, what becomes one of the main versions of this religious right is deliberately a counterculture. There was a group of very, very influential religious right. One of the most influential is a guy by the name of Timothy LaHaye. You may not have heard of him, but Timothy LaHaye has sold more books than any other single woman, except who wrote the Harry Potter stuff. Beatrice, whatever.
Rowling, yeah.
Right. The Left Behind series. Right. The first evangelical president that we had was Jimmy Carter, who now looks leftish, which he was. And these conservative right, Timothy LaHaye, Ted Haggard, they supported Carter. But he didn't turn out to be the kind of evangelical they expected. And so they went to interview him late in his term to try to decide whether they were going to support him for his second term, when he ran his second term. And the issue over which they split from Carter was the Equal Rights Amendment, equal rights for women. Right? They came out of that meeting and said, this is not our guy. And they shifted to Ronald Reagan. And I think that is the moment Ronald Reagan became the next president. It was the political right. Now Reagan is not the kind of Republican that today's far right Republicans are. They're the antithesis of Reagan in many ways. But that whole move, so in certain ways, today's Republican Party is a counterculture to the Reagan Party, which is a counterculture to the evangelicals who supported Carter, right? It's negation of negation of negation.
Something that, and then you look at the overarching, like, what connects those two things. And I'm trying to pull us back a little bit to some of the like talks about how the 60s like has influenced our politics and culture today. If you look at both the left and the right poles now, like there are two different kinds of spirituality and new age ideas that have been adopted on either end. Because you have the Oprah Winfrey's, the Marianne Williamsons, and the Deepak Chopra, which are very left in their outward facing politics. But then you have the people who are storming the Capitol who are very much involved in, like, QAnon is informed by all these same spiritual ideas, and they're two opposite sides of the political pole, and all of that spirituality is rooted in one of the most popular figureheads of spirituality in the 60s is a man by the name of Baba Ram Dass, who before he became Baba Ram Dass was Richard Alpert, who was partners with Timothy Leary, and they were doing experiments at Harvard with LSD. And so then you have this trajectory of this small pocket of leftist ideology, nurtured by the youth culture in the 60s and 70s. That has
Alethea, tell them where LSD was originally. Who's doing the original experimentation in LSD?
You mean in was it Stockholm?
No, in the United States. The CIA.
The CIA. Oh, sure. They were doing it right alongside Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert at Harvard, and then the CIA goes to Stanford and starts doing all these same experiments with Stanford students, and there's all kinds of controversies that Ken Kesey, really popular novelist at the time, started this whole movement with this he called them the Merry Pranksters, and they started like really influencing the youth and promoting drug culture alongside Leary, who's on the East Coast. So Ken Kesey's kind of the lowbrow, like hippie, like he's country, like grew up in the cornfields, and then you had the Leary and the Alperts who are more highbrow, promoting drugs on that side of like the country.
And the Grateful Dead was the house band for all of this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They did all the acid tests until, they'll then go into Woodstock and Altamont stuff.
Woodstock and what did you say?
Altamont. Where that concert at Altamont where the Hell's Angels.
Oh, sure. You know more historically about that, but I mean, yeah, Woodstock is related to this. I mean, geographically, it's in the same part of the country as
upstate New York.
Yeah, but I mean, Ken Kesey, they piled up on a bus and started these road trips, and they're all inspired by the beatnik poets, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg,
drove across the country.
Neil Cassidy, who is a character in On the Road. Kerouac's on the road. I can't remember his name in the book. Is on the bus with Kesey and all of the pranksters, and so like that, the idea of like exploring America via the highway becomes huge. And
metaphor of the trip.
Right. Are you tripping at two different ways at the same time? But then all these kids, have basically a pilgrimage to this rural town in rural or in upstate New York. And they're the third largest city for a few days in the country.
Woodstock.
400,000 kids.
All high.
Well, yeah, most of them go to watch this music festival. And I mean, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Joan Baez, like there's all of the big, everyone but Bob Dylan, really, all the big like protest singers and like everybody who's up and coming are also performing there. And so like this is huge phenomenon of the music, the drugs, and the youth. Everyone's naked, like the sex is very much there as well. All the commune, and of course the left at that time was kind of split between poor whites, rich whites, and the black community, like and so there's different layers there, but those are mostly like middle class white youth who can get in their cars and drive 10-12 hours to this remote part of New York to trip. And
so there's massive socioeconomic as well as racial stratification. So Sandra's asking, how much impact did Woodstock have on the people who were? I think a lot. I mean, I wasn't there. I was studying. I mean, but and Woodstock had an afterlife. I mean, through the music and through the films. So I think Woodstock was massive. And then at the same time, which gets overlooked, was the Summer of Love, right?
Right. The same summer, a few months, might have been a few weeks actually, before it was a music festival in Harlem and Marcus Garvey Park. It's like maybe
which is right near Columbia.
Yeah. They had the Summer of Soul Festival, and there's a new documentary out on it, which is really interesting. I've not watched the whole thing in detail, but it's what I have seen is very good. And it's all Black artists putting on this, basically the same thing as Harlem is, the same thing as Woodstock. Wasn't quite as big.
But it's not talked about much.
Right, it's definitely looked over, but it's kind of a precursor to like the beginnings of the hip hop community in New York, because they used to just
and we really need to talk a little bit more too about the racial violence in the United States at this time. In the summer of '67, I grew up right next to Newark, about 20 miles from New York City. And right next to a town called Newark, which burnt to the ground in 1967. There was also this huge split in the African American community about the relationship to the anti-war movement. And Martin Luther King was very much a proponent of nonviolence and integration. And he eventually, many in the civil rights movement resisted joining the anti-war movement because they thought it would detract from the engagement with the civil rights movement. King eventually became persuaded that many of those who were being shot, and remember, there's 550,000 Americans died in Vietnam, right? That many of them were poor and people of color. So he eventually came out against the war in Vietnam and was much criticized for that. At the same time, you had the emergence of a violent wing of the movement among African Americans. Like 1968 was the Olympics, where the 3 of the American athletes protested on the medal stand by raising their fists. And Alethea, you can say more about Malcolm X.
Sure, right. The other pole to that is Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, who was very they were also pushing to continue segregation on the basis of Black superiority. And it's interesting to look at the evolution of how those two figures and their ideologies have continued into all the racial issues we're having today in America. And I'm dealing with this a little in my thesis is related to the course that Mark and I are teaching. And the actress I have playing the Black character in the script and I have been kind of talking about how to deal with this in the script itself, because there's a celebration of Martin Luther King, particularly by white America still, and Malcolm X by Black America for various reasons, because there's a lot of information coming out about the both of them that wasn't necessarily relevant or wasn't necessarily well known at the time, but the issue of police brutality is still very relevant today. It has not really there's not been any progress made in that. You can map that through from the 60s through the 90s through hip hop culture into today, and so there's this question of how to deal with nonviolence and segregation.
But you also what we're trying to point out is that these divisions were not only between Blacks and whites, but or people of color and whites, but there were stratifications and oppositions within each of those poles, right? The disenfranchised white, the poor whites, and disenfranchised whites versus the elites, and the ones getting the attention were many of the students of these elite campuses who had never had any contact with anything that they were protesting about, never, right? And on the side of on the side of African Americans, you had this profound split, which Alethea says continues today, between those who promote nonviolence and those who promote violence in the quest for social change.
Absolutely, and the distinction is also religious. The Martin Luther King Jr. is a Baptist preacher, and Malcolm X is a part of the Nation of Islam, and right. So and Islam was really popularity of Islam really heightened during that time, particularly in the Black community, as a push against Christian beliefs that have kind of been pushed onto them from slavery, and so there's this trying to break out of the culture that they've been integrated, and that's obviously a complicated use of the word, into this Christian society, and using Islam to try to push back against that and have their own identity in in these issues. But
And they're a figure like Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay. I mean, the importance of him as a figure, and not only religiously, as Alethea says, but politically, because Clay refused to go into the army, right, and was stripped of his title for a couple of years. So Clay Ali was an important political as well as a religious figure that sort of brings together all of these different kinds of strands in all this. I'm a little bit concerned. I do want to be sure that we untangle or unravel this connection between the drug culture and Silicon Valley. Because
yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask, because we touched upon this. You said a few words about that, but it seems quite interesting what you mean by that. So if you could elaborate this a little bit more, I think that could be very interesting.
So maybe we could start this off a little bit. Alethea, you start off and then I'll pick it up. You start off by talking a little bit about the Whole Earth Catalog.
Sure. So the Whole Earth Catalog.
Do people know what the Whole Earth Catalog is? Probably not. It's probably.
I
okay,
don't.
So, yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Sure. So, are you want to?
No. You go ahead.
Okay. It's the first preliminary social network that was started in
1968, right? With a picture of the Earth from the moon. I mean, that became the symbol.
Right. So it was started by a man by the name of Stuart Brand, and he was running around with all of the who I was mentioning before, Ken Kesey, and all of these more like figureheads in the hippie side of the counterculture. And he was very much interested in media, and he was going to all of these workshops at Esalen, which is in Haight-Ashbury in California. And all of these scientists are also going alongside all of these figureheads of the counterculture. And he created this, it's a magazine catalog of, it's supposed to be like a collective piece of work, and everybody can
build their own things.
Right.
It was to do your own thing. And there's a lot at the same time. There's a lot of back to the earth type stuff.
Right. So you would submit all of these, it was organized by geographic location, and you would submit here's where you can go to get these materials, here's where you can go to get food, here are hotels in this place. So for people who are living nomadic lives throughout the United States can know where to go and where to get food. There's a section for towns that are safe for people of color to stay in throughout the country. And it was
sort of like survivalism today in certain ways, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It was basically Sears catalog for communes and hippies before
right.
before it.
So on the one hand, what you have is this kind of back to the earth movement, because the world's going to blow up. All hell's going to break loose, and it's like all the Silicon Valley guys now who are building bomb shelters in the Midwest, these wealthy people are converting the silos that were used for IBM missiles during the Cold War into luxury bomb shelters. That's literally going on today, right? You can't make this stuff up, right? So these guys, but there was this kind of back to the earth kind of thing, goes with, as Alethea said, with commune stuff and everything else. But at the same time, there was this fascination with technology, and Brand was at the center of all of this. And many of those, Steve Wozniak was a kid when he invented Apple. Jobs sold it, Wozniak built it. But the Haight-Ashbury was sort of the center of the drug and counterculture in San Francisco. These kids formed this thing called Homebrew Computer Club, where they meet regularly to show each other their computers that they were beginning to build. That's where Apple came from, precisely precisely from that. And there was a strong kind of, it's a strongly individualistic kind of view that goes with that, and a strong suspicion of government and the like. And again, for those who were involved with the counterculture, with the drug culture in certain ways, this piece, the PC revolution was going to be exactly what they needed in order to get away from this centralized and hierarchical authority, whether it be government, whether it be finance, or whether it be education, right? And as I said before, the revolution was going to be information in the hands of the people, right? And that, that all is what was fueling a lot of those young people at the beginning who were involved with creating what eventually becomes cyberculture. So in that sense, this cyberculture has a direct connection in all these ways with this counterculture of the 60s. And guess what? They were right. This technology is transformative of consciousness. But look at the way it's transformed consciousness. Social media today programs us, right? It has transformed human consciousness, right? If you look at the young people today in this country, and I don't know if this is the way it is in Europe, right? There is a pandemic of anxiety and despair in this country among young people. Three-quarters of our class, if not more, I asked the other day, are in therapy of some sort, right? And there is a direct line between this condition of young people being so distressed and everything and social media. It begins, and it's documented, it begins in 2010. That's when you see this curve, and it's all good. So they're right. I mean, but the drugs change consciousness in one way. I mean, it is transforming human consciousness and therefore human life. Alethea?
Yeah, I mean that was about the point that I was going to make was that the whole Earth electronic link, which came out of the whole Earth catalog, was this preliminary version of social media that we have today. And I mean, I don't know, I don't keep up with Silicon Valley particularly in depth, but there is certainly the idea that everyone is often using mind-altering drugs. Like that's part of the culture there, which is just so that's just directly a part of the lineage of that part of the country and like the ethos of the scientific development and technological development, and as well as the ethos, like this new like way of seeing the world religiously through technological development, with Ray Kurzweils and all of those guys is really interesting too. If you're gonna pull the thread of New Age spirituality and twist it up into Silicon Valley, yeah.
Alethea, again, connected up. Say something about your take on the resurgence of psychedelics among your generation.
Well, I think part of it has to go with this like idea of therapeutic mind. I mean, there's a lot of research right now going on with psychedelic mushrooms, ketamine treatments, and MDMA for like veterans, being used as therapy, and I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is like everyone is tired of using their phones all the time, but you're so addicted to it that you don't really know it's hard to like pull yourself out of it. Like everybody knows it's bad for them, but everybody continues to use it, and so there's this interest in using the psychedelics to deal with that, but also I think that the culture of like hallucinogens is perpetuated through social media. Like there was a huge, through COVID, a huge trend towards New Age spirituality to astrology and those kinds of things. a lot of indigenous religions got really popular among my generation. And it's all the same ideas that, you know, the Zen Buddhism brings in. Of course, it's all flavored differently because of the different geographic locations, and like, you know, the, you know, philosophical ideas differ, of course, but they in essence are being adopted and doing the same thing for our culture now as they were in the 60s, as Buddhism was doing for the culture in the 60s. And both, I mean, indigenous culture is full of psychedelic hallucinogenic use in ritual contexts. And so like ayahuasca and peyote are like very much like, people are very excited about those kinds of things. Because
now, today.
Today they're trying to escape this reality that we have to deal with politically, socially, and technologically.
We are slowly coming to the end of our 90 minutes, but I have a final question that comes from what you said earlier, what you were just talking about, that today's cyberculture, but also Woodstock. These are kind of examples when counterculture kind of becomes mainstream, and I'm wondering whether it's inevitable or these examples are other exemptions. What do you think about that?
Well, I've said for many years, you know, staying on the outside is a full-time job. I mean, look, again, if you think of this dialectically, if I can, because that's, you know, that's really sort of the philosophical tradition out of which I come. I mean, part of what we've been trying to show is the interrelationship between any culture and its counterculture. Right? Countercultures form as a structure of resistance. And Alethea, earlier in talking about the 60s, put a slant on it that is correct, but I hadn't emphasized enough, and that is a generational kind of slant that young people I mean, so, you know, the generation of my parents had been involved in the Second World War. They wanted to settle down. They wanted a refrigerator and they wanted a car and so on and so forth. And they wanted some regularity to their lives. You know, to their children, that became anathema. Right? That was death. And so they were resisting. They were resisting that. But then what happens? I mean, capitalism's greatest genius is to appropriate that which is designed to resist it and use it for its own ends, right? So these protest singers that we're talking about, it kills me, because what we see now are those songs, and in some cases, those performers advertising trucks and IBM, right? Protest is appropriated by the system that it is designed to resist. And once that appropriation takes place, which is what we have with what has happened to the internet, right? The internet has created a completely new form of capitalism. That could be a topic for another whole show. It's finance capitalism, right? And that finance capitalism is at the root of the social inequalities today, because there is a complete disparity between financial assets and non-financial assets that makes the wealth gap insurmountable, and it's going to get worse, right? So these technologies that were supposed to liberate the global village, bring us all together, have created a pernicious form of political and economic inequality. So what's happened, right? That which is designed to resist one system, the military-industrial complex, has now turned into a financial, economic, and entertainment complex, right? That calls for further resistance now. And in part, I think what Alethea's generation is trying to figure out is, are there any kind of models in the 60s that could give us some lessons for how to deal with this all-encompassing and repressive structure that we find ourselves in now?
Absolutely. And just tacking on the end of that, I think the question of inevitability gets complicated. And I usually like to push away from that in terms of like, like there's, if every new generation is going to push back against their parents, like why do we keep progressing? Like there's that that kind of just leads you back to the same hopelessness that we're trying to get out of. So I think that at the end of the day, like I don't know about my peers necessarily, but I know I think about like, how can I change what I've been given for better in a way that allows for my children's generations to do the same to what I'm able to do. And so like there's, instead of making it like an inevitability feels, it feels hopeless in and of itself. And rather I try to look at it as like, this is what we get to do as a society, or like this is like part of like this is a part of I don't know how to articulate it, but it's very much like a reflection of our position in society today, and historically, in this historical moment, like how we are dealing with each other and creating social cohesion constantly out of disunity.
Let me wrap it by just putting this twist on it and bringing it back to what Alethea is doing, what I've been doing my whole life, and what we are doing in this course, and in this salon. I tell students, I've told Alethea many times, hopelessness is a luxury we cannot afford. And though both of us in different ways are drawn to hopelessness, I have long believed that the way to change society is to change consciousness. It's not an either or, right? And I believe teaching is one way to do that. I've said Alethea is an artist. What she does in her plays, and the title of her play, I think, is itself intriguing. You didn't tell them that, Alethea. Tell them the title.
Yeah, it's called "This Is Your Computer on Drugs."
Right. I mean, what she does in her art is, again, an effort to change consciousness by drawing people into the work of art. And what I've tried to do in my teaching over my whole career is to help young people see the world differently. What we try to do in this course is a combination of her art and my teaching. And it's a generational thing, because, I am handing off what I've tried to do for my whole career to Alethea and her generation. And whether they are successful or not is going to depend in part upon, whether their consciousness and their awareness can be transformed.
Thank you so much. I think it was a perfect closing remark. And so thank you all for joining us today. I hope you also enjoyed this fascinating conversation as much as I did. And I hope to see you in the next salon of this series, which will be about anti-capitalism. We don't have the final date yet, but it will be on the website as soon as we finalize it. So thank you again. And
well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day or evening, depending on where you are.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks.